For this episode of Scholar Talks, the guiding question is what was the relationship between Revolutionary War battlefield deeds and the inspiring words and principles of the Declaration of Independence? Our guest, Edward Larson, is a professor of law and history at Pepperdine University. He is the Pulitzer Prize winning author of Summer for the Gods, which is on the Scopes trial, and several books on the American founding, including The Return of George Washington, Liberty and Slavery and the Birth of a Nation, and his latest book, today's topic, Declaring Independence, Why 1776 Matters. I am Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Scholar Talks in the America 250 series. Ed, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on.
Right. Yeah, I love your newest book. And I love to, so many people talk about the Declaration and its principles, intellectually, abstractly. Other people focus on the war. It's one of the few books I've ever read that bring those two strains together. You definitely really weave those together. So I'm eager to talk about the book. It's really excellent.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to do because my question, there are other great books, no doubt about it. Think of this recent television series by Ken Burns. Think about Rich Atkinson's great books on the war. But they're looking at the Revolutionary War, what happened in the battlefield. McCullum did the same thing in 1776. It's all about battles. What I tried to do was people always talk about, even then, they talk about the spirit of 1776. You hear it now. They don't talk about the spirit of the American Revolution. They talk about the spirit of 1776. And as a longtime history professor who would teach that era, my curiosity as we approach the 250th anniversary was, why does 1776? I know why the revolution matters, but why does 1776 matter? Indeed, it did at the time. Adams, Jefferson, they talked about the spirit of 1776. Indeed, if you look at the seal of the United States, which was created in 1777 by Charles Thomson, the Secretary of the Continental Congress, you can see it on the back of your $1 bill, the Great Seal. And it says in Latin, something new under the sun. It's got that pyramid with the eye. But then it says at the bottom, it says 1776 in Roman numerals. 1776. Lincoln talked about 1776 later. Frederick Douglass, you name it. Franklin Delano Roosevelt during World War II. So why did that year matter was my question, as opposed to the revolution. And so to do that, what I did was I just looked at basically all the newspapers and read them for the year. And I looked at the letters from the founders, but also from the troops in the field. They're generally available, but I read them for the year to see what was happening in that year that made that year important. It doesn't mean that 1775 wasn't important or 1781 when the Battle of Yorktown. They're important too. But why does 1776 matter? And that became my challenge. And when doing so, I ended up right where you said. It turns out it's an interplay of words inspiring deeds and actions inspiring ideals. It's a mixture of the two. It is not exclusively one or the other.
Great. So jumping into the book. So how did the resistance against Great Britain and the pamphlet war in the 1760s, 1770s represent American arguments for rights and self-government, government by consent?
You go back really to, in a major way, to 1765. You have Otis's pamphlet, magnificent pamphlet, other ones by Hopkins, Delaney, these various pamphlets that go back to the Stamp Act crisis, where the issue was taxation without representation. And Americans, fearful for their property, argued against what Parliament was doing. It wasn't just the taxation without representation, was also the Quebec Act and the Proclamation of 1763 taking the West, and it was also the Declaratory Act,
Mhm.
and then the Townsend Tariffs, the Tea Act. But those were all directed against Parliament and were really rooted in economics.
Mhm.
And what changed in 1776 was a new conception of what the problem was. They realized in 1776 that the problem was not taxation without representation. That was simply a symptom of the real problem was authoritarian rule. The real problem was the monarch. You only have to go back to probably the most important document of 1775, the Declaration of Causes of Necessity for Taking Up Arms. You talk about battles were already taken, happening. You had Lexington and Concord. You had 20,000 Patriot militia forces from New England surrounding the 4,000 British on that island like Boston. And we were in the middle of war. They'd appointed Congress had adopted this army as the Continental Army. They had named George Washington as the leader,
Mhm.
and he was on their way up. And yet, in the Declaration explaining all this, it says, we are reduced to the alternative choosing between unconditional submission to the tyranny of parliamentary ministers or resistance by force. And then it stresses, we have not raised armies with the ambitious design of separating from Great Britain, but in defense of the freedom that is our birthright as subjects of the king. They still view themselves as part of the empire. They still view themselves as British, not Americans. And
Mhm.
we're not fighting for separation. What changed? Whereas you go all the way up to December, you read all these letters, hardly anyone was arguing for among the patriots. Hardly anyone was arguing for independence. Not Adams, not even Paine, not Washington. What changed during 1776 is mostly in the first half of the year, but certainly by the end, is that virtually all the patriots, except some outliers like John Dickinson, had come around that
Mhm.
independence was needed, that the problem wasn't merely we want lower taxes. The problem was authoritarian rule. What we want is something new under the sun, representative government, Republican government. We want rule of law. We don't want rule of king. As Paine said in Common Sense, the will of the king is as much of the law of the land in Britain as it is in France. In America, the law is king. For in an absolute government, the king is law. So in free countries, the law ought to become king. And that swept the country and is captured in the Declaration of Independence. This was what was something new under the sun, and how Paine could write. The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth. The cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind. Well, revolutions were nothing new. Countries had splintered off empires since the time of Rome and Greece and Carthage, and before that. What was new was the idea that this breaking off to have the people as sovereign.
Mhm.
And as a result, during that year, the states all wrote new constitutions, the first written constitutions in the history of mankind.
Right. So you bring up a really interesting point that I'd really love to dial in even more. Is that I've always found it so anomalous that here we are at war, Lexington and Concord, Bunker Hill, these major battles. The British are burning Norfolk and Falmouth and other towns.
Charlestown.
Yeah, yeah, and yet we're at war, and yet we don't declare independence, right? It's what almost a year and a quarter, almost a year and a half. I mean, how do you explain that anomaly?
Well, they were blaming, if you look at all the petitions being written by the states, there were many, many of them. All the letters being written, and of course, the Olive Branch petition,
Hmm.
they were always blaming Parliament. Parliament was viewed as this foreign entity that was adopted by what? A small electorate in England, about 144,000 people. And Jefferson, in his great treatise of 1774, his pamphlet, Summary View. He says, we don't want to have tyranny of 144,000 people over us because they were politically responsive to a small electorate in England and to an unelected king and House of Lords. What they realized was, and I think Norfolk was a big part of it. You look at what happened in January. Three things coincided, and I think they were all critical. One was, if you read the newspapers, that's when Americans first receive the King's speech from the throne. That's like the State of the Union message, where the King goes before Parliament on the throne and reads official policy. It took place in the end of October 1775, but it didn't reach the colonies for the most part, except for one exception. It didn't reach you don't see it in the newspapers until January. And in that, the King, not Parliament, the King declares that the colonies he revokes his protection of the colonies. Before this, all the petitions asked for the King. They viewed themselves, the people in America, the settlers in America viewed themselves as British citizens. We are as British as somebody in London. And they would write that. And they expected the King to protect them. Now they read, he declares them out of his protection. He announces that he's going to send the largest British overseas army in the history of the world against them, assemble troops from throughout the empire, and worse yet, hire German mercenaries who were viewed as like ruthless barbarians. German mercenaries were going to come over by the 10,000. And in addition, the largest navy in the history of Britain to subdue the colonies. He announced that. They read that. And at the same time, they get word of the British official policy, burning of Norfolk. Norfolk then was the second most important city in the American South. And it was leveled. And the way it's reported in the newspapers, it happens on January 1, but the word spreads during January. And you read it in the newspapers, and the way it's described, it was completely a British atrocity, an unexcusable British policy that, unlike Falmouth, was the direct result of British policy. And then, right at the same time, in the same newspapers, out comes Common Sense. And Common Sense, in the middle of January, becomes the most widely read pamphlet in the history of America. The percentage of Americans reading it, no book has equaled it ever since then, except maybe the Bible, of course. And it's read everywhere. It's republished everywhere. And within 2 weeks, everybody's read it or heard it. They read it aloud as well, 100,000 copies. And it makes it all make sense. It says the problem is not Parliament. The problem is the King. Of more worth is one honest man to society, Paine writes. Of more worth is one honest man to society and in the sight of God than all the crowned ruffians that ever lived. That applies to any tyrant, any absolute government, any authoritarian government. No, what we want, if we design, and nobody had it, it was something new. Now, granted, the idea was around from Rousseau and from Locke's second treatise on government, that you form representative governments. Paine works it out in detail, an idea of we can have representative government. The people shall be sovereign. We will choose our own representatives through free, fair, and frequent elections. That's what he's saying. He writes right in this in January, we have it in our power to begin the world over again. Not since the day of Noah have people had this opportunity. That electricity, coupled with reading the King's speech from the throne and the atrocity and action, the atrocity of the British at Norfolk, that combined to literally turn everybody around for independence, because the solution now became not lower taxes and taxation without representation. The solution now became representative government, Republican rule, rule of law. And that spirit was the spirit that transformed mind. Washington, of course, has common sense read to the troops besieging Boston. It boosts their morale. And he writes, after seeing the response, he says, these battles, thinking of Norfolk, he just received also news of Norfolk. These battles, coupled with the irrefutable arguments of the pamphlet Common Sense, will leave nobody not supporting independence. You can see it in the writings of Abigail Adams, her letters to her husband. You can see it in John Adams' own writing. You can see it in, you could go on and on. Mercy Warren, Otis Warren, you can see it in her writings. It just changes the way people think. From South Carolina, North Carolina, the word comes out. Now, these words of Paine made what was happening to them on the battlefield and in the actions that made it, gave it a whole new understanding and light. And so the result was a conviction for independence.
Great. Yeah. So that really explains well the significance of Thomas Paine's common sense, just how important it was to move that tie towards independence. There was another person who was also very important. So what was John Adams' role? He certainly believed he had a very big role, and he did, in driving momentum for independence in the Second Continental Congress. I'm thinking about his May 15th preamble to this May 10th resolution, but just the behind the scenes politicking and so forth. So tell us about Adams's role.
John Adams, this is the John Adams I love, the John Adams from 1776. Um, he becomes pulled over to the cause of revolution. He wasn't for, by his own description, he was not necessarily for independence. He was for reconciliation up through the end of 1775. But he becomes convinced that only independence. And if you see his private letters, which I've tried to follow very closely and summarize in the book, um, he says, what is independence? Well, independence for him was a new state constitution in every one of the colonies. That
Mhm.
is, the colonies had been formed with charters from the king. And those charters, the king was sovereign. And so you had a charter for Virginia, or you had a charter for Pennsylvania, a charter for Massachusetts. Some set up proprietorship colonies, but really the proprietor, like the Penn family, were based in England under the king. Some were directly royal colonies. In all cases, the king was sovereign. And he thought what independence was, in his mind, was breaking with the king. And he viewed each state, each colony as a separate entity. And so he believed that each needed a new Republican representative constitution that created a republic. And so he pushed that through. And he repeatedly said, what is independence? Well, he was right. Independence was a new constitution, a Republican constitution in every state, recognition by some other states, like France, and getting those things done. Um, and ultimately um, uh, driving the British out. So his first cause becomes these new constitutions. So some of them, anticipating all his writing, because he's writing and others are writing and having the same thinking, some states have rushed ahead, like South Carolina and New Hampshire earlier in 1775. But Paine, opposed by John Dickinson, who still wants reconciliation and know this will be a big break, he doesn't need unanimity. You need unanimity for a Declaration of Independence, but you only need a majority vote for a resolution on independent governments. And he writes it, he gets it passed, and he writes a fiery preamble um, calling on every state to adopt a new constitution, to use quoting directly from it, best conducive to the happiness and safety of their constituents in particular and America in general. And then he writes his most important pamphlet ever, Thoughts on Government. It's a great pamphlet
Mhm.
um, that comes out in May. Um, where he tries to describe that sort of government that everybody should be adopted, and it becomes a model for North Carolina, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware directly. And in it, he asks, when, this is what he writes, he puts an exclamation point after that, when had a people a full power and fair opportunity to form and establish the wisest and happiest government that human wisdom can contrive, adding that Republican governments are such a government, that republics are governments, to his words, of law, not of men. Now, this echoes common sense, though the government he designs are different. In common sense,
Mhm.
it's proposing governments, basically a one-house legislature. Adams has two-house balanced government, still a very weak executive. Power is in the elected representatives, and both of them call for annual elections that are free, fair, and frequent. But the point is, um, they both use these terms. The end of government, they write, the end of government is security, liberty, and the goal is, as Paine puts it, the greatest happiness at the least expense. That now compare that with everything before. Could you imagine George III or any English monarch or any monarch in Europe saying his purpose was to secure the liberty and happiness of the people? No, you've got Louis the 14th declaring the state is me. Christian IV in Denmark, the other great absolute monarch of that decade, was saying similar things. The purpose of the state is to back me. I'm sovereign. Um, no, no, you're not, it's saying. And this is captured in all the state constitutions, but my favorite, probably in this respect, is the North Carolina Constitution of 1776, which was directly inspired by Adams' thoughts on government. And the opening line of that Constitution is, all political power is vested in and derived from the people only. Now, in a world where kings are sovereign, and you speak of divine rights, to say that all political power is vested and derived from the people only, that indeed is revolutionary, something new under the sun. And Adams is at the heart of that argument.
Right, right. And I was going to ask you, which is a great segue to say, there's this relationship between the Constitution making on the state level, and then, we had Virginia and other states. They're declaring their rights. They're shaping new constitutions, Republican constitutions, as you say. So there's that direct relationship with declaring independence and what's happening in the Declaration. Maybe you can look into that relationship just a little bit more closely.
Absolutely. The Declaration follows directly from that.
Mhm.
Um, Now, remember, Adams thought what was important were new state constitutions, and that if you have a state constitution declaring the people sovereign and the king not sovereign, and including grievances against the king, you look through the state
Mhm.
constitutions, they take a very similar format. They have a Bill of Rights declaring the rights of the people. They have the grievances against the king. The order of the two move around, and then they have the structure, typically a very representative structure, broad voting rights for people, maybe a two-house legislature, maybe one, if two, higher property rights for the other. Um, Various requirements to discourage gerrymandering and to encourage legislation that the public knows about and can respond to. Very similar. But at the same time, and it doesn't come from Adams, the thinking comes from these various states as they're drafting their constitutions. And Virginia is the critical example, but it's true from all of them. They say, well, yes, we're declaring our independence through our state constitution, but we need to collectively declare our independence too. So the Virginia legislature, which is working on its new constitution, sends a resolution up. And the resolution, this was the idea of the governor, It was actually, others didn't push it. Patrick Henry did not push this, but the governor gets through that we think that Congress should also declare the independence of the whole, as well as we're declaring independence of each state. So they send up their resolution. It's carried out by Richard Henry Lee. It arrives in June and says that these colonies are and of right should be free and independent states, and ask Congress to adopt it. Well, as soon as they get it, they realize we need an explanation justifying it. Just like all the state constitutions are drafting a list of grievances against the king that justify their declaring independence under this notion of popular sovereignty and right to rebel that then appears in the Declaration of Independence. And so they assigned the task to a committee. Thomas Jefferson is chair of it. Now, Jefferson's curious because he thought the main business was happening in the states. So he had wanted to leave Congress when Virginia starts writing its constitution. But so did everybody else. And he was a junior member of the Virginia delegation. And off goes Wythe and the other ones down to Williamsburg to write the Virginia Constitution. So Jefferson is sitting up there in Philadelphia, working mostly on drafts that he's sending down to Virginia because he's getting word that they don't have a consensus yet. Actually, he was fed wrong information. George Mason had taken over the whole operation and was just writing it himself. But Jefferson wrote of the new Constitution in a letter, in truth, that is the Virginia Constitution, in truth, it is the whole object of the present controversy. For if a bad government be instituted for us in the future, it would have been as well to have accepted the first bad one offered to us from beyond the water, that means in Britain, without the risk and expense of contest. He thought that was the business. But because he's still back there, he gets assigned as chair of the committee. It was known as a great writer thanks to his summer review pamphlet from a couple of years before. And he's assigned, along with the other two great writers there, John Adams and Franklin, a couple others to balance geographically, but they were the only three that really worked on the Declaration itself. And so he's assigned the task to write it. Meanwhile, he's mostly sending drafts back to Virginia. And he's getting, by the end, drafts from George Mason of what they're doing. So he's takes these various pieces, and in many ways, the Declaration of Independence reads quite a bit like the Virginia Constitution. He takes what Mason has written, he takes what he has written, one on the logic of the whole thing, the preamble part, the first part. Next, on the grievances, are basically his list of grievances that he's written, plus a few thrown in from other states that didn't particularly affect Virginia. And then the end is really Richard Henry Lee's resolution from Virginia, tagged on the end. That's the Declaration of Independence. Adams, who, of course, always looked down on everybody else and viewed himself with great self-importance, he deserves a lot, but he also was that way. He sneered that the Declaration of Independence was the piecework of an afternoon. And Jefferson rightly responded and said, well, they didn't ask me to write anything new. I was supposed to summarize views that were already out there. But in truth, it did only take a couple days. But in truth, it was a work of absolute brilliance because he weaves these parts together. Well, if it's piecework, it's like a fine Virginia quilt. He takes these pieces, these ideas that are already floating around. My favorite example of that is people often give credit, where credit is not due, to Jefferson for changing John Locke's life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. But that wasn't him. That was Paine. Paine talks the purpose of government is the greatest sum of individual happiness with the least national expense. It's Adams. Adams in thoughts on government. He says the purpose is to create and establish the wisest and happiest government that human wisdom can contrive. Everyone was talking. What was the purpose of government? They didn't mean pleasure. They didn't mean pleasure. The purpose of government isn't pleasure. But the purpose of government was, well, what are we for? Why do we have a government? It's not to serve a king. What it is to these issues that Paine, Adams, and all the others are talking about: security, liberty, individual liberty, and happiness. That becomes, in Jefferson's words, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And you could not say it better. Indeed, ever after, I know you're interested in the future impact of the Declaration of Independence. Well, various things are important, but nothing was more important than that phrasing, because I could make an essay that what becomes the American dream is captured in that phrase, that the inalienable right of people for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is, in a nutshell, what the American dream becomes. And that there's nothing self-evident about that. No country would have argued that that was its purpose before. Nobody would have said this is self-evident, because it wasn't a truth before, but it became the basis of the American Republic, the American experiment in popular government.
Beautifully put. Maybe that's your next book. So, uh, very good. My final question is how we started. So, what was the relationship between, in a nutshell, Revolutionary War battlefield deeds and the inspiring words and principles of this Declaration of Independence?
I think it's a give and take, and that's what I try to capture in the book. Um, Throughout the year, and I think you could stretch this out, but my expertise from my late research is the year 1776. And what I see is words inspiring deeds, actions inspiring ideals. You can see that in so many ways, but you can't, but among them is the letters by the soldiers in the field. The soldiers in the field begin writing, actually we'll concede, late in 1775, but certainly accelerating in 1776. You see these letters from the Massachusetts militia that's on the field surrounding Boston during the siege of Boston. The letters they write to John Hancock and John Adams and Samuel Adams, their representatives in Philadelphia. Letters from privates, because in Massachusetts, everybody thinks they're equal because they're all Puritans. And they have this sense of religious equality, but also from generals. It doesn't matter, too. They're begging, give us something more to fight for. Lower taxes is not it. Give us something more to fight for. Declare independence and tell us why. And so then Washington has common sense, read to the troops in the siege of Boston. It demonstrably gives them more power. But still, he needed those cannons brought over the mountains by Knox and put in Dorchester Heights, about where the Kennedy Library is now, to force the British out of Boston. And that fact on the ground, that a ragtag American army of militia, led by a little experienced General Washington, could drive the British army out of Boston, was empowering. It made Washington a hero immediately. He receives commendations from every place in Massachusetts, but way beyond, around the colonies. And that sense, coupled with having read Thomas Paine, who, it never call him Tom, it's always Thomas Paine, who writes that fighting for the cause of independence, this glorious cause, No army in the world can defeat us. And then they see what actually happens in Boston. And that just energizes the revolution. And then as it unfolds, the the atrocities the British cause, particularly after the fall of Fort Washington, where Washington makes the mistake of leaving 2,000 men in what he thought was an impregnable fort in what's now Washington Heights, right at the end of the George Washington Bridge in Manhattan, lets the rest fall, but he thought he could get them across the river as he did in after the Battle of Brooklyn Heights. He didn't. And those troops are put on these prison hulls, these decommissioned ships in the East River, where they literally all die. It's just absolute unjustifiable atrocity. If the British would do that to Americans, and then the atrocities mostly blamed on the Hessians as the British Army pushes across New Jersey at the end of 1770, basically in October, November, and December of 1776, again, 1776. And the way they're written up in the newspapers of rape, of pillage, of murder, partly by the British, allowed by the British overseers, but mostly attributed to the Germans. If the king would send over people to do that, these atrocities in the battlefield. So it's not the victories. The only victory really was the evacuation of Boston. The atrocities that followed, the defeats in New York area and New Jersey, and then finally at the very last day of the war of the year, the Battle of Trenton, where Washington makes this strategic recrossing of the Delaware and manages, it's more of a PR victory. It's not that significant. It's a small Hessian outpost that's overwhelmed by everything that's left of Washington's army that outnumbered him 4-1. But the sheer fact that you could regain a foothold in New Jersey after the British had basically taken the state, the moral victory, those actions in the field, working with the ideas. So the ideas, only the call for independence, only the Declaration of Independence, which led, of course, to the immediate uprising in New York where they pulled down the King's statue. The power of those words drive the fight. And then the fight helps underscore and reinforce the words so that you end with Thomas Paine again in the first crisis, brought out on the eve of the Battle of Trenton, where he says, "These are the times that try men's souls. Those that persevere now." Tyranny like hell is hard to conquer, but those that persevere now will reap the accolades of all future generations. Those words are amazing, but they only work. If Thomas Paine had brought out common sense a year earlier, it would have had no meaning. It took what was happening in the field, going back and forth with the ideas that gave those actions meaning. And that was why 1776 matters.
Edward Larson, I want to thank you very much for joining us to discuss your latest book, Declaring Independence, Why 1776 Matters. And thank you all for joining this episode of Scholar Talks in our America 250 series. Please check out the other videos in the series on our channel and go ahead and click subscribe.